over 1 million soldiers died in the Iran-Iraq War between 1980 and 1988. Most of them were teenagers. Some were just 14 years old when they were sent to the front lines. They had no training, no proper equipment, and many of them never came home. But what makes one war worse than another? Is it the number of dead? The methods used to kill? Or is it something else entirely? Something harder to measure? The suffering of those who had no choice but to fight. From 1914 to 1988, soldiers endured conditions that most of us cannot begin to comprehend. Trench warfare that turned men's feet black with rot. Frozen wastelands where entire armies starved to death. Jungles filled with invisible enemies and chemical poisons. And wars fought by children, sent to die in human waves. This is not a story about strategy or politics. This is about what it meant to be a soldier in the worst wars in modern history. 4 conflicts, 74 years, and horrors that still haunt us today. Let's start where it all began, in the mud-filled trenches of World War I. In August 1914, when the war began, soldiers on both sides believed they would be home by Christmas. They marched off with flags waving and crowds cheering. They had no idea what was waiting for them. Within months, the war had ground to a halt. Neither side could advance. Neither side could retreat. And so they dug in. They dug trenches, 400 miles of them, stretching from the North Sea all the way to Switzerland. And between these trenches lay a strip of land that came to be known as No Man's Land. No Man's Land was hell on earth. Barbed wire tangled across craters filled with mud and water, shell holes deep enough to drown in, and everywhere the bodies of those who had tried to cross and failed. Some had been there for weeks, months even. There was no way to retrieve them. The trenches themselves were barely better. They were supposed to be temporary, but they became home. Soldiers lived in them for months at a time, sometimes years. The walls were packed dirt, held together with sandbags and wooden planks. When it rained, and it rained often, the trenches flooded. Water reached up to their knees, sometimes their waists. And that water, it was not clean. It was mixed with mud, with waste, with blood. Soldiers stood in it for days. Their boots rotted away. Their feet began to rot too. The condition was called trench foot. The skin would turn white, then red, then black. Toes would die and fall off. Many men had to have their feet amputated just to survive. But the water was not the only problem. The trenches were infested with rats. Huge rats, some as big as cats. They fed on the rations when they could get them, but more often they fed on the dead, and on the living too, if a soldier was wounded and could not fight them off. At night, you could hear them moving through the trenches, thousands of them, their claws scratching against the wood. Then there were the lice. Every soldier had them. They lived in the seams of uniforms, in hair, in beards. They bit constantly, leaving red welts that became infected. Soldiers would try to burn them out with cigarettes or candle flames, but it was useless. Within hours, the lice would be back. The smell was something no one who lived through it could ever forget. It was the smell of unwashed bodies, of human waste, of rotting flesh. There were latrines, but they were crude, just holes dug at the end of the trench. When it rained, they overflowed. The smell never left. It soaked into clothing, into skin. Soldiers could not escape it. And if you were wounded, there was little help. Medical care was basic at best. A small cut could become infected within days. Infection meant gangrene, Gangrene meant amputation. Many soldiers died, not from bullets or shells, but from infections that started with the smallest injury. Then, in April 1915, something new appeared. The Germans released chlorine gas across the battlefield near Ypres in Belgium. It drifted in yellowish-green clouds toward the Allied trenches. The soldiers had no idea what it was. No protection, no warning. The gas burned their lungs. It blinded them. It suffocated them. Men clawed at their throats, gasping for air that would not come. Those who survived were left with permanent damage, scarred lungs, ruined eyesight, and the constant fear that the wind would shift and the gas would come again. Gas masks were eventually distributed, but they were uncomfortable and limited vision, and they did not always work. Soldiers had to carry them everywhere, sleep with them within reach, because the gas could come at any time, day or night. But perhaps the worst part of trench warfare was the artillery. The constant, endless bombardment. Shells fell day and night, without warning. You could be eating, sleeping, writing a letter home, and then the whistle of an incoming shell. Sometimes you had seconds to take cover, sometimes you had none. The explosions were deafening. They shook the ground. They collapsed trenches, burying men alive. Shrapnel tore through bodies, leaving wounds that could not be healed. And even if you were not hit, the blast could rupture your eardrums, damage your organs, knock you unconscious. Living under constant bombardment did something to the mind. Soldiers could not sleep, could not eat, could not think clearly. They shook uncontrollably. They could not stop crying. They stared at nothing for hours. This was called shell shock. But the military did not understand shell shock. They saw it as cowardice, as weakness. Soldiers suffering from shell shock were often punished. Some were tied to posts as examples. Some were court-martialed. And some were executed by their own side for refusing to fight. Millions died in World War I. Millions more were wounded. But even those who survived carried the war with them for the rest of their lives. The nightmares, the scars, the memories of friends who never made it out of the trenches. And yet, as terrible as World War I was, the next war would prove even worse. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. It was the largest military invasion in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by tanks, aircraft, and artillery, crossed into Soviet territory along a front that stretched nearly 2,000 miles. The Germans expected a quick victory. They had conquered most of Europe in a matter of months. They believed the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks. They were wrong. The scale of the Eastern Front was beyond anything the world had seen before. Battles were not fought over a few miles of ground. They were fought across entire regions. Thousands of miles of open steppe, dense forest, frozen tundra. And everywhere, people were dying. At first, the German advance seemed unstoppable. Soviet forces were caught off guard, disorganized, retreating. Entire armies were surrounded and destroyed. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured in the first months of the war. But the Soviets did not surrender. They kept fighting, and fighting, and fighting. Then winter came. The German army was not prepared for a Russian winter. Their uniforms were designed for Western Europe, not for temperatures that dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever they could find: newspaper, straw, cloth stripped from the dead. But it was never enough. Frostbite spread through the ranks like a plague. Fingers and toes turned black and had to be amputated. Engines froze, weapons jammed. Horses, tens of thousands of them, died from the cold, and still, the orders were to advance. Food became scarce, supply lines stretched too thin, and the vast distances meant that even when supplies were available, they could not reach the front. Soldiers ate whatever they could find: boiled leather, frozen potatoes, sometimes nothing at all. Starvation weakened them, made them slow, made them easy targets. Disease followed starvation: typhus, dysentery, pneumonia. Field hospitals were overwhelmed, and many soldiers died not from enemy fire, but from infections and illness. Bodies were left where they fell because the ground was too frozen to bury them. But the turning point of the Eastern Front came at Stalingrad. In the summer of 1942, German forces reached the city of Stalingrad on the banks of the Volga River. Hitler wanted the city taken. Stalin ordered it defended at any cost. And so began one of the bloodiest battles in human history. The fighting in Stalingrad was not like anything that had come before. This was urban combat, street by street, building by building, room by room. Sometimes soldiers fought on different floors of the same building, separated only by rubble and darkness. There was no front line in Stalingrad. The Germans would take a factory in the morning, and the Soviets would retake it by nightfall. A building might change hands a dozen times in a single day. Snipers hid in the ruins, waiting for hours for a single shot. Artillery turned entire blocks into dust and ash. The soldiers lived in the wreckage. They slept in basements and cellars. They drank water contaminated with oil and blood. They ate whatever scraps they could find, and all around them the city burned. In November 1942, the Soviets launched a counteroffensive. They surrounded the German Sixth Army, trapping over 300,000 soldiers inside the ruined city. Hitler ordered them to hold their position. He promised supplies and reinforcements, but they never came. The encircled Germans starved. They froze. They ran out of ammunition, out of medicine, out of hope. Wounded soldiers lay in makeshift hospitals with no way to treat them. Many simply gave up, too weak to move, waiting to die. By February 1943, it was over. The German Sixth Army surrendered. Over 300,000 German soldiers had entered the battle. Fewer than 90,000 were taken prisoner. Most of those prisoners would die in Soviet camps. Only a few thousand ever made it home, but the Soviets paid an even higher price. Estimates vary. But most historians believe that over 1 million Soviet soldiers and civilians died in and around Stalingrad. The city itself was destroyed. Nothing remained but rubble and bones. And Stalingrad was just one battle. The Eastern Front raged for nearly 4 years. Millions of soldiers on both sides were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire villages and cities were wiped off the map. The land itself was scarred by trenches, craters, and mass graves. The soldiers who fought on the Eastern Front endured conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. Cold that froze flesh, hunger that hollowed out bodies, fear that never left, and bombardments that went on for days without pause. Many of those who survived were never the same. They had seen too much, lost too much. The war had taken everything from them, and even when it ended, the memories remained. But the horrors of the Eastern Front were not the last chapter in this story. 2 decades later, on the other side of the world, a different kind of war was waiting. The Vietnam War began in 1955 and lasted for 20 years. It was a war unlike any that had come before it. There were no clear front lines, no massive tank battles, no grand offensives across open ground. Instead, soldiers fought in dense jungles and swamps where visibility was measured in feet, not miles. The jungle became the enemy's greatest weapon. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces knew the terrain. They had lived there their entire lives. They could move through it silently, set up ambushes, and disappear before anyone knew they were there. For American and South Vietnamese soldiers, every step forward was a step into the unknown. You could walk through the jungle for hours and see nothing, hear nothing but the sounds of insects and birds, and then, without warning, gunfire would erupt from all directions. Soldiers would drop to the ground, returning fire at targets they could not see. By the time the shooting stopped, the enemy was already gone. Booby traps were everywhere. Punji sticks, sharpened bamboo stakes, hidden in pits, coated with poison or waste to cause infection. Tripwires connected to grenades or artillery shells. Mines buried in paths that looked safe. A single wrong step could mean death or mutilation. Some traps were designed not to kill, but to maim. A soldier who lost a leg required other soldiers to carry him, required medical evacuation, required resources. The Viet Cong understood that wounding a soldier was sometimes more effective than killing one. Snipers added another layer of fear. They could be anywhere, in trees, in bushes, in villages that seemed empty. A shot would ring out and someone would fall. The other soldiers would hit the ground, scan the jungle, but see nothing. The sniper was already repositioning or melting back into the foliage. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers could not relax, could not let their guard down. Even in base camps, there was always the threat of mortar attacks or sappers infiltrating the perimeter. Sleep became difficult. Anxiety became constant. Some soldiers described it as feeling watched every moment of every day. Then there was Agent Orange. The U.S. military decided that if the enemy was using the jungle for cover, they would remove the jungle. Between 1961 and 1971, American forces sprayed nearly 20 million gallons of herbicides over Vietnam. The goal was to defoliate the trees, to expose enemy positions and supply routes. Agent Orange was the most widely used of these chemicals. It was named for the orange stripe on the barrels it came in. Planes and helicopters sprayed it over vast areas of jungle and farmland. Within days, the leaves would wither and fall. Within weeks, entire forests were dead. But Agent Orange did more than kill plants. It contained dioxin, one of the most toxic chemicals known to science. And soldiers were exposed to it constantly. They walked through areas that had been sprayed. They drank water contaminated with it. They breathed air filled with its residue. At first, no one understood the danger. But years later, the effects became clear. Soldiers who had been exposed began developing cancers: leukemia, lymphoma, prostate cancer. Their children were born with birth defects: spina bifida, cleft palates, missing limbs. The chemical had altered their DNA, and the damage was passed down to the next generation. Even today, decades after the war ended, people in Vietnam and veterans around the world are still suffering from the effects of Agent Orange. The U.S. government has acknowledged some responsibility, but for many, the help came too late or not at all. Beyond the chemical warfare, the environment itself was hostile. Vietnam's climate was hot and humid, with temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees. Soldiers carried heavy packs, sometimes weighing 70 pounds or more. Through thick vegetation and across rice paddies, heat exhaustion was common. Men would collapse, unable to continue. The humidity meant that nothing ever dried. Uniforms stayed damp. Skin stayed damp. This led to jungle rot, a fungal infection that ate away at the skin, particularly on the feet. Wounds would not heal properly in the moisture and heat, becoming infected easily. Malaria was rampant. Mosquitoes bred in the standing water of rice paddies and swamps. Soldiers took anti-malarial pills, but they did not always work. Those who contracted malaria suffered from high fevers, chills, and weakness. Some died. Others were incapacitated for weeks. Dysentery and other intestinal diseases spread quickly. Clean water was hard to come by, and the conditions were ideal for bacteria. Soldiers suffered from constant diarrhea, dehydration, and stomach cramps. In the middle of a combat zone, being sick like this was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. As the war dragged on, morale among American troops plummeted. Many soldiers questioned why they were there, what they were fighting for. News from home showed protests, anger, division. They felt abandoned by their country even while they were still fighting. The mental strain broke many of them. Post-traumatic stress disorder, though not yet widely recognized or named, affected thousands of soldiers. They relived firefights in their minds, saw dead friends in their dreams, jumped at sudden sounds, could not readjust to normal life even after they made it home. Unlike veterans of previous wars, those who returned from Vietnam were often met with hostility or indifference. There were no parades, no celebrations. Many were told to forget their uniforms and blend back into society as if nothing had happened. The war left them scarred, physically and mentally, and for many, those scars never healed. The Vietnam War claimed over 58,000 American lives and millions of Vietnamese. But the number of those who survived and carried the war with them is far higher. And for what? The war ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon, the very outcome the U.S. had fought for 20 years to prevent. But if Vietnam showed the cost of a war fought in jungles against an unseen enemy, the next conflict would show something even more disturbing: the cost of a war fought by children. On September 22, 1980, Iraqi forces under Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. The attack came without warning. Iraqi planes bombed Iranian airfields. Tanks rolled across the border. Saddam believed the war would be over quickly. He believed Iran, still recovering from its 1979 revolution, would collapse within weeks. He was wrong. The war that followed lasted 8 years, and it became one of the most brutal, senseless conflicts of the 20th century. What made it different from the wars that came before was not just the tactics used or the weapons deployed. It was who was sent to fight. Iran, desperate for manpower, began conscripting boys, not young men, boys. Some were 16, some were 15, some were as young as 14 years old. They were handed rifles they barely knew how to use, given a few days of training at most, and sent to the front lines. Many of these boys had never left their villages before, had never seen combat, had never seen death. But now they were soldiers, expected to fight and die for their country. And die they did, by the tens of thousands. Iraq had the advantage in terms of equipment and training. They had tanks, aircraft, artillery. Iran had numbers. And so Iranian commanders adopted a tactic that had not been seen on such a scale since World War I: human wave attacks. The strategy was simple and horrifying. Send waves of soldiers, often these young conscripts, rushing toward enemy positions. The goal was to overwhelm the Iraqis through sheer numbers. Many of the boys were told they were martyrs, that their deaths would be honored, that paradise awaited them. Some believed it, some had no choice but to go forward. The Iraqi forces would open fire with machine guns and artillery. The first wave would fall, then the second, then the third. Bodies piled up in front of Iraqi trenches and fortifications. And still, more waves would come. Eventually the Iraqi guns would overheat or run out of ammunition, and that is when the surviving Iranian soldiers would break through. But the cost was staggering. Thousands of boys died in these attacks. Thousands more were wounded, left screaming in no man's land with no one to help them. Some attacks resulted in minimal territorial gains. Some resulted in none at all. the commanders would simply order another attack the next day. Then there was the chemical warfare. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, began using chemical weapons on a massive scale. Mustard gas, sarin, tabun. These were not new weapons. They had been used in World War I and were banned under international law. But Saddam did not care about international law. Mustard gas caused blistering on the skin and in the lungs. Soldiers exposed to it would develop painful burns that could take weeks to heal, if they healed at all. Many were left permanently scarred. Sarin and tabun were nerve agents. They caused convulsions, paralysis, and death within minutes. Iranian soldiers often had no protection. Gas masks were in short supply, and even when they were available, they were frequently old, damaged, or poorly fitted. Some soldiers tried to protect themselves with wet cloths over their faces, but it was useless against chemical weapons. When the gas came, there was panic. Soldiers would claw at their throats, gasping for air. Their eyes would burn. Their skin would blister. Those who survived the initial exposure were often left with long-term damage, ruined lungs, blindness, neurological problems that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses, many of whom had little training in treating chemical exposure, did what they could. But there were too many casualties and not enough supplies. Burn wards filled beyond capacity. Soldiers lay on floors, in hallways, sometimes outside, waiting for treatment that might never come. And those who recovered, or at least survived, were often sent back to the front after only a few weeks. There was no time for proper recovery, no time for rehabilitation. The war demanded bodies, and so they were sent back, still weak, still damaged, to face the same horrors again. The psychological damage was perhaps even worse than the physical. These were boys who had been forced to grow up in the worst way possible. They had seen their friends die, had killed others themselves, had lived through gas attacks and bombardments and endless fear. Many of them stopped sleeping, stopped eating, stopped feeling anything at all. Some simply broke. They would sit in trenches, staring at nothing, unresponsive to orders or threats. Others deserted when they could, though desertion often meant execution if they were caught. And those who stayed, they stayed because they had no other choice. The war dragged on, year after year, attack after attack. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. The front lines barely moved. Cities on both sides were bombed. Tankers in the Persian Gulf were attacked. The war spread, threatening to pull in other nations, but still it continued. By the time it ended in 1988, over 1 million people had died. Most of them were soldiers. Most of them were young. And what did either side gain? Nothing. The border returned to where it had been before the war started. No territory changed hands. No political goals were achieved. It was a war fought for nothing. A war that destroyed an entire generation. And the boys who survived carried the weight of it for the rest of their lives. The nightmares, the scars, the guilt of having lived when so many others did not. The Iran-Iraq War is often forgotten in the West. It does not receive the same attention as World War I or World War II or even Vietnam. But for those who lived through it, for the families who lost sons and brothers, for the survivors still dealing with the aftermath, it was just as real, just as brutal, just as unforgivable. We remember these wars today not to glorify them but to understand them, to remember that behind every statistic there was a person, someone who laughed and cried and hoped to go home, someone who deserved better than what they got. If you found this information valuable, please consider supporting this channel by liking this video and subscribing for more content on history's untold stories. Leave a comment below about which conflict affected you the most, or share this with someone who needs to hear these stories. These soldiers endured the worst that humanity could throw at them. The least we can do is remember.